What's up, design family, and welcome to another episode of FittDesign TV. On today's episode, we have a measuring tutorial for you guys. I'll be measuring a sports bra within the context of sportswear design, and I'll be running you guys through what measurements that I consider in my design process in terms of creating the perfect fit for a sports bra, whether it's a regular sports bra, it's a crop style sports bra, it's a modified sports bra. The measurements that are needed usually stay consistent. So if you've ever wondered what measurements that you need to consider to create the perfect fit, watch this video, you're gonna find out. Hey guys, and welcome to FittDesign TV. So glad to have you here. On this channel, we discuss all things sports fashion, graphic design, manufacturing, and technology. We'll discuss key topics, answer pressing questions, and provide actionable steps on starting your own product line. If you're interested in any of the above topics, stick around. You're in for a good one. With a sports bra, very similar to the previous tutorial that we've done on how to measure leggings, there are key measurements that you have to consider regardless. And what you need to get these measurements is pretty simple. You need your subject, so a sports bra, and you need a great tailor's tape. I love to use this flexible tape made out of fiberglass, very simple, very cheap, and it has inches on one side and centimeters on the other side. I cannot recommend them enough, and I keep them on my persons at all time. In terms of the measurements we're going to take, there are a variety of measurements, but we'll keep it simple. You also need a perfectly flat surface. If you're measuring on anything that's uneven, that's going to skew your measurements, and you definitely don't want that. With this style of measuring, accuracy is the name of the game. Obviously, you're going to be inaccurate to a certain degree, but you should minimize that as much as possible to make sure that your measurements are on point. We have our subject here. This is a regular style sports bra, so it's not a cropped length and it's not a particularly short sports bra. It kind of comes up just about the rib cage. It's the traditional type of activewear sports bra that you can think of. So this is a seamless garment, but it doesn't really have much effect on the overall size of the sports bra. This is a size small, I know this, so I'm pretty much familiar with the measurements. In terms of what measurements I'm going to consider, first we'll start off with the width measurements. In terms of the width measurements, I'll want to get the chest measurement. So what we refer to as the chest is just armpit to armpit. Make sure you lay the garment out as flat as possible, avoiding any uneven bumps. Take your measuring tape, start off with the zero side, lay down, and go all the way across to your other side. So that would be considered your chest measurement. From your armpit to armpit, going parallel across, and taking down that measurement. Here we have it as 13.5. So that's the first measurement that we usually consider. And then the next width measurement that definitely has to be considered in this case is the bottom width measurement. So you'll notice, just as with leggings, the chest measurement, or like the upper measurement of the width and the lower measurement of the width, are essential. We all know that our physiques are not just straight slabs, and they have curves and they have shapes. So that needs to be reflected in the garment. You'd never want your chest and your bottom width measurements to be the same, especially in a sports bra, as you're coming up from the bust area that's going to require more fabric to accommodate, slimming down into your waist area. So that needs to be reflected in your measurements. That's why we always spec a chest measurement, and we also spec a waist or a bottom width measurement. The bottom width measurement is taken at the bottom of the waistband, from, again, left and right, making sure to maintain a perfectly flat fabric surface. We go from left to right. Same idea, making sure that the tape is flat throughout and that it's measured exactly from edge to edge, as accurately as we can. You'll notice here that the chest measurement was 13.5 and then the bottom width measurement was 12. In our experience, that's consistent with what we've seen across a wide range of sports bras, where the chest and the bottom width usually differ between 1 to 1.5 inches as a rule of thumb. So you're always going to get that change in width when it comes from the chest to the bottom width. do bear that in mind, and it's not something that you need to be worried about. You're going to get it different in width when it comes to this measurement. In terms of the width measurements that we need, that's pretty much it for the core measurements. Now we're going to go for the vertical measurements that will be measured from up to down, down to up. Most of these measurements will be perpendicular measurements. So what does a perpendicular measurement mean? Because we cannot accurately measure things along seams, as you've seen here. If we want to measure the armhole circumference, we'd have to measure along the seam. We don't want to do that because that's not necessarily an accurate way of measuring your garment. We use perpendicular length measurements. So if you can imagine with your perpendicular length measurements, if you're measuring from up to down, you have a grid, a series of grid lines that come across the sports bra. And we're essentially measuring from grid line to grid line in a parallel fashion or a perpendicular fashion. And the reason we do that is to maintain consistency with our measurements. It's very important when measuring between different garment types or just in general different designs within the same garment type that you maintain the consistency so that you can make sure that you have a baseline of measurements to go off of. There's no use in measuring when your method for measuring is different between designs. You want to make sure that, cool, I measured this way for design X, that I'm going to measure in the same format for design Y. Again, this is not necessarily the universal way of measuring. This is the way that we measure, especially for fitting purposes at FittDesign. We found it to be very, very useful, and there's really no guide or tutorial out there on how to measure these garments, especially when laying them flat. So this is our way to kind of share that with you guys. The first thing that I'll need is a armhole measurement. So the armhole measurement that we use is essentially the amount of space that the garment allows for the armhole. And that measurement we use as a perpendicular measurement from the grid line that comes the top left of the left strap. So this area right here, create a grid line that comes out, and then right down to the armpit. So the same kind of grid line that you would use to measure your chest measurement. And again, it's very, very important to make sure that you're maintaining the consistency of your measurements throughout. We'll come up from the armpit, we'll measure up, and we will come across to here. So imagine the grid line is extending from your strap out to your tape, and you pretty much have to make it as close an estimate as possible to where that grid line is. Sometimes you can actually just create a 90-degree angle with the tape to make sure that your measurement is coming along the right. So as you become more comfortable, you can skip this step. For us, I'm just able to do it by looking at it. If you want to make absolutely sure, create a 90-degree angle with your tape to make sure that you're measuring exactly to the line that needs to be measured to. And obviously this is going to vary a little bit, but it is a little tip that I found is helpful, especially when getting started. So this is your perpendicular armhole measurement. It's very important because it'll dictate the amount of space your arms are going to have, and if you have too small of an armhole, you're going to get the fabric riding up, especially on the bust area. That's going to be uncomfortable, and if it's too low, you're going to get too much of the bust showing. So you want to make sure to find the accurate or the most optimal armhole area that's both comfortable and can cover up the areas that need to be covered up. In terms of the next length measurements that we'll measure, pretty much this is the main measurement. So in terms of measuring the length of the sports bra, there are two main types of measurements. There's the HPS, so that's basically the highest point to the lowest point on the sports bra, and the highest point to the lowest point on the sports bra typically comes from the top left or top right corner of the strap. So basically where the inner area of the strap meets and goes back in to the back of the sports bra, which is typically over here or over here. And then the lowest point is all the way to the back, or pretty much create a grid line along this area and measure to the bottom width of your sports bra. So typically the grid line that you would use to measure the bottom width of your sports bra. So this is your HPS measurement, and it's typically the most used one for sports bras, just because you don't usually use the center back measurement, and this is something that we'll get into as well. The center back measurement is measured from the center of the rear neckline down to the bottom hem, so the grid line where you take your bottom width. However, with sports bras, because the drop, if you notice, the rear neckline isn't actually flush with the tops of your straps, the inner tops of your straps. And that differs depending on the design of sports bra. So to maintain consistency and to avoid having to take that rear drop into account, because it does skew your center back measurements. Some sports bras really have a deep cut in the back, which can make the garment, if you're using your center back length, it can make the garment seem artificially short, right? Because you're not accounting for that drop in neckline space in the back. So we typically take the HBS and just avoid that altogether, because that's a measurement that really matters in terms of the coverage of the sports bra. Again, we'll go from the inner strap at the highest point of the sports bra in terms of a perpendicular sense, all the way down to the bottom width of the grid line that you would use to take your bottom width. Again, like I mentioned, the center back, which is another option, you can take it. However, in this case, it's not necessarily recommended. As I've mentioned, it's from the center back of the rear neckline down to the bottom hem. You'll typically notice a small difference in the sizes. It can range anywhere from 0.5 inches on a regular sports bra with a regular drop in the neckline to something like 4 inches if really the design calls for it and you have an open back neck. It depends on your design. So it's not something that you can take as gospel, but you can use the center back. And the center back is a lot more prevalent on t-shirts where the drop in the rear neckline is a lot more consistent. Next we'll want to take the front neckline measurement. In terms of the front neckline measurement, I'll typically want to take them in 2 stages. So again, the standard front neckline measurement would go from the center back. So in terms of measuring how far the front neckline comes in, and what that will dictate is the amount of cleavage shown, just the amount of chest area shown. So too large of a front neckline drop is going to show too much cleavage, and too little of a neckline drop is going to choke up on the neck. So you want to make sure that you get the front drop to the point where you want it to be. So it depends on your design. If you want to show more cleavage, that's something that you can do. And if you want to have it riding up higher on the neck, as if it's turtleneck sports bra or any other kind of design that calls for that, that is something you can do. However, do bear in mind that these measurements rely on 2 parts for the front neckline drop. The first is the distance from your highest point to your rear neckline. As we just mentioned, that's typically around 0.5 inches on a sports bra like this, where the rear neckline sits naturally at the neck. And again, that's measured using these grids that you extend visually. In this case, that drop is around 0.75 inches. And then we'll go from the rear neckline down to the front neckline. And here it's around 6 inches. And bear in mind, here we're measuring from the bottom of the bound edge on the rear neckline to the bottom of the bound edge on the front neckline. The reason we're doing that is the bound edge has some thickness to it. In order to maintain the consistency of those measurements, so instead of measuring from the bottom of the bound edge on the rear neckline to the top of the bound edge on the front neckline, that's going to give around a 0.5 inch skew in our measurements. So it's important to maintain consistency. If you're measuring from the top of the bound edge, make sure to measure to the other top of the bound edge. And if you're measuring from the bottom of the bound edge, make sure to measure to the other bottom of the bound edge. Again, if you guys are confused, the bound edge is this extra piece of fabric that's secured to the hems to make sure to provide strength, elasticity, and just to finish the hems overall. This is very important to maintain, and please, whatever method you choose, top of the bound edge to top of the bound edge, bottom of the bound edge to bottom of the bound edge, maintain consistency. For us, we use the bottom of the bound edge. It's not necessarily that that's what you need to use, but that is what we use, and that's what I'm sharing with you guys today. So like I mentioned, for the front neckline drop, it's important to understand what your HBS to your rear neckline is, and then what your rear neckline is to your front neckline. And that'll just give you an idea of what your overall front neckline drop is. Next, we'll want to measure the strap width. And as you can see here on this design, and this is very typical of other designs, your strap width is going to vary significantly throughout your sports bra, right? As the pattern comes in towards the top of the shoulders, and then it flares out towards the back, and then it goes back in. In this case, which is it's a racer saw, that's all going to have a difference. What I like to do is I typically like to measure my strap at the area where the front pattern and the back pattern joins, which is typically around 0.5 inches away from this crease right here. So in this case, it's very easy to identify because we have an overlock stitch securing it. And we'll measure from the outer of the bound edge on the left side to the outer of the bound edge on the right side. And here it's around 1.5 in my experience. It's very consistent, and that's a traditional strap size for a sports bra. Anything thicker and you'll definitely see, oh, that looks a bit thick. If the design calls for that, awesome. Anything thinner and you may lose some support, and at the same time it will look a little bit thin. And again, if that's part of your design, that's more than fine. Just bear in mind that in our experience, 1.5 inches is great for a standard sports bra width in terms of the strap. That's the strap width. And now we also need to measure the neck width. So the neck width is the outer neck width and then the inner neck width. The outer neck width is measured from the left outer strap, basically the area where the sports bra turns from the front back in, creates this little crease, and then onto the other side. And again, it's very important to maintain that consistency going from edge to edge. And here we have around 7.5, and then we'll want to measure the inner neck width. And the inner neck width is basically just accommodating for the strap on the inside. And the thicker your strap is, so let's just say your strap is thicker than 1.5 as we just discussed, you're going to have a smaller inner neck width in relationship to your outer neck width. So maintaining 1.5, you'll notice that since we have 1.5 inches on each side, if our outer neck width is 7.5, as we just measured, or actually it's 7.5, and we know both straps are 1.5, then we can estimate through an educated guess that the inner strap is going to be, or the inner neck width is going to be around 4.5. So 7.5 minus 3, right? 1.5 for each strap is equal to 4.5. So there's a lot of maths in this, and you'll be surprised how much technical details garments can have. You'll get a lot more comfortable with it as time goes on, and you'll start to be able to know instantly, cool, this measurement's gonna be like this measurement relates to that, and do bear in mind, a lot of measurements relate to each other. So when you change a measurement, it's gonna affect the other measurements. So having an understanding of your measurements and how they push and pull on each other is key. So just to recap, for the widths, you have the outer neck width and then the inner neck width. The last measurement that I typically like to take is the measurement. It's a vertical measurement, one that I forgot to mention. It's from the top, or from the armpit area down the side to the bottom width. So the grid line that we'd use to measure to the chest down to the grid line that we would use to measure the bottom width. And why is that important? That's important because I need to see how much coverage I'm having on the side of my sports bra. If it's too large, it's going to drop too much, and if it's too little, it's going to reveal too much. So making sure that I have a good understanding of that measurement. Again, vertical measurement, making sure to measure from edge to edge. Here it's around 6.5, and that includes the waistband thickness. If that's 6.5, we'll also want to measure the waistband thickness, which here is 1.5. Most waistbands on regular sports bras will range from 1.5 inches to 2 inches. Anything more than 2 inches, you're starting to get into crop top sports bra territory, and you need to adjust the overall length of the sports bra to accommodate. Why is that important? So here we'll measure the HPS, and I'll give you guys a very specific example. The overall length of the sports bra is 13.5 inches, which is it's a decent size for a regular length to a little bit of a longer sports bra. So it's not a crop top sports bra, but it's a bit longer than what we usually see. Usually we'll see on a size small, 13 inches for like a regular cut sports bra. Anything longer than that, you're going to start to edge into crop top sports bra. However, if you have your 13.5 inches and you increase the waistband height without increasing the overall HPS, what you're gonna have is that sports bra is going to start to dig into your bust line, and that's going to be very uncomfortable. It's going to create chafing, and that's just not going to be a comfortable kind of experience for the end user. So you'll want to accommodate by increasing the HPS overall, and also making sure that you increase the side seam length to accommodate and to give your waistband enough space to rise without cutting into your bust line. So like I said, it's a fascinating kind of world in terms of how these different measurements affect each other. I'd highly recommend you guys take out any sports bra, just experiment with measuring things out, measure between sizes, right? Because the way that the measurements go between sizes is typically consistent, and understanding how those sizes react to each other is also very, very important. Grading is another video for another day. Grading just basically explains how measurements are increased or decreased between sizes. We'll get into that some other time. If you want to see that video, leave a comment below, let us know that you're interested. If you guys enjoyed this video, consider smashing a thumbs up. If you enjoy this type of content, consider subscribing. If you want to see more videos like this in terms of how we measure out key garments, leave a comment in terms of which item you want to see next. Thank you guys so much for tuning into FittDesign TV. Until next time, stay awesome.